So the thing is, can we start playing with conspiracy theories rather than believing in them? Because believing in is really a religious thing. I think possibly if you could believe in it in a playful way, you could be in more of a dancing situation.
Hello there, welcome to the Bardo podcast. Today's guest is Lionel Snell, perhaps best known by his pen name, Ramsay Dukes. Lionel is someone that I've mentioned on the podcast before, particularly his excellently titled essay, Sex Secrets of the Black Magicians Exposed, one of the best titles ever written. The great Alan Moore has called Lionel the most lucid, coherent and insightful intellect to emerge from British occultism for several decades. Although Lionel has spent much of his life writing about magic and the Western esoteric tradition, this conversation is really about how human beings make meaning through stories, rituals, symbols, art and play, and whether we realise it or not, all of us engage in magical thinking in one form or another. We talk about reality tunnels, conspiracy theories, advertising, AI, creativity, power, ritual, consciousness, and why treating beliefs as tools rather than truths might actually make us a little freer. Lionel is a truly rare thinker, and he makes me see familiar things from completely different angles, and I absolutely love this conversation. My name is Marc Salmon, by the way. I'm a comedian and a practicing Buddhist who needs a lot more practice. I also spent much of my working life in adult social care, and this is a podcast about comedy, philosophy, spirituality, creativity, and how confused human beings try to live well when none of us really know what the F is going on. That's enough from me. So let's sit back, relax, and float downstream as we enter the Bardo. Well, I mean, I first came across your work, I think it was Secrets of the Black Magicians Exposed, which is the best title of any book ever, I think.
Oh, yes. Well, what about Blast Your Way to Megabutts with my secret sex power formula? That's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Yeah. For that one, I put the subtitle, and
Right.
other reflections upon the spiritual path. I thought that would
Yeah.
that would sort of get the crazies away, but no, I had one or two people complaining that. Yeah.
What was the thinking behind those titles?
Well, in the 60s, early 70s, it was a sort of hippie thing, and a lot of alternative things, and I remember there was someone who wrote an interesting little booklet about television, but he called it Sex and Television, because just the sort of thing. Oh, if you're going to get published, you've got to get the word sex in some way, you see, and so I thought of a sort of really trashy title, Sex Secrets of the Black Magician Exposed. But I thought, no, I can't do that, So
Yeah.
I just made it words and let the joke come out during the book. Yeah. Yeah.
So to begin with, what I thought we could talk about is that I've just finished reading My Years of Magical Thinking, and
Yes.
so a lot of, I guess in inverted, sort of educated people, I guess, there's maybe an assumption in the West as well that magical thinking is something we've kind of outgrown, but it keeps reappearing. It keeps reappearing in
Yes.
politics,
Yes.
marketing, performance, like. So, and in the book, you argue that magical thinking isn't some primitive mistake that science sort of triumphed over. So I wonder, why, to begin with, why should someone listening to this conversation care? Why should they give a damn about magical thinking
Yes.
today?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's rather interesting because I have been asked to work with some academics on academic paper about the relevance of magical thinking to chronic pain sufferers, and it's very clear that I keep having to sort of correct them, because the academic idea is that magical thinking, as you say, is the stupid thing we used to do until we learnt about the world and the real world and solid objects, and I don't agree with that. And I began, it really was when I was at school. C.P. Snow talked about this division in academia between what he called the arts and the sciences cultures, and how there's sort of two different ways of looking at the world. And science culture has become so predominant in the universities, and they were saying this is what we ought to be teaching, not that sort of wishy-washy arty stuff. And so that was in the 60s, well, the 50s it was really, and the 60s. And I thought I could see that thing about this. It's not like a different recipe or a different set of laws. It's just a different way of looking at the world. And I thought, well, surely there's also a religious way of looking at the world too, which is just as different as art and science. And then through my interest in magic, I thought, well, there's also a magical way of looking at the world. And more recently, I've sort of, to give an idea of what those differences are, and people will say, oh, how do you define magical thinking? And I say, no, I don't. It's something you discover, not something you define. And the example I gave was a sort of set of coincidences. It was a man whose daughter was going to be 17 years old on the 17th of April. And you think, well, that's rather nice. So he goes into town to buy a present for her and collects a few second-hand books and things. And he's rather amused to see the bill comes to exactly £17. Yeah. Well, and he's about to forget it, but when he has to go and get a bus back home, the only bus that will take him home is a 17 bus. And he begins to think, oh, that's all these 17s, what's happening? Now, what I suggest is that there's several different ways you could respond to that. One is to say, she's 17 on the 17th. What's the significance of 17? I might look at the 17th tarot card to see if there's anything there, or the 17th hexagram, or a bit of numerology, 7 + 1 is 8, and so on and so forth. And you can spend the afternoon sort of playing around with 17s to see if there's something meaningful about it and special. The other thing is someone might say, oh, I like that. That's a bit of drama. I like the style of that. I'm going to build on it. Tonight I'll make a cake with 17 candles, and I'll put up lots of 17 balloons around the place, and I'll tell the story of what happened this morning as I light the candles, and it'll make it in a bit of a special thing. Another reaction might be to say, is God sending me a message? 70, 70, 70. I know what we'll do tonight when we're celebrating my daughter's birthday. We'll all read the 17th Psalm together. And in fact, that might become a family tradition. Each year we'll read the Psalm for that day. And the fourth person would say, that's just nothing. There's no connection possible between a bus and a bill and a date and a year of age. It's meaningless. Now, what I suggested was that I think the first three people actually will have a richer life experience. Nothing dramatic, but I mean, if you spent an afternoon studying the symbolism of 17 and various different things like that, you'd be pretty stupid not to get anything out of that, nothing interesting. And the person who makes that sort of party ritual is actually making that a very memorable occasion for a daughter who will take lots of photographs, things like that, and people will enjoy it. And the religious person has sort of brought his family together and has set up a tradition. Now, what I suggest is that if I said that to the fourth person, he would say, what a load of rubbish. I didn't waste my time on pointless children's games. I didn't waste my time on mumbo jumbo or a God that doesn't exist. I went back to work and I earned money. What do you mean richer? I'm the one who, and that is what I give those as examples of the magical thinking is being aware of the connectedness of things. And if you know things are connected, or I'll use the word believe, I'm going to be careful of that word later. if you believe things are connected, then life becomes very interesting because you can start looking for connections, playing with connections, and even trying to use these subtle connections. Artistically, finding these connections is like, it's as rich as it's like a bit of drama, it adds meaning to something. You can see new angles on it, like that. And the religious person connects his family to God, if you like, whatever the belief is. So this is, whereas the other person says, no, there's no connection between these things. It's just apophenia, or whatever it is, and he thinks he's being very clear and modern and up to date in his thinking because he's rejecting all these earlier superstitious ways of looking at things. Now, the thing is that I had an experience when I was at Cambridge of a ghost. I saw a ghost. And it was one night, I woke up, opened my eyes, and there was this old man with a dagger leaning over the bed, ready to stab me. The thing was, I had been brought up in a haunted house, so I didn't panic and try and turn on the light or put my head under the pillow. I just stared. And I didn't blink. I just stared at this image. And after a while, it sort of melted into the background, which was a swirly curtain that was hanging there. Now, I thought I was being given an explanation. My mind, it was an optical illusion, had seen this swirly pattern and had made sense of it by imagining this face. Now, the thing that interests me about optical illusions is that you can play with them to and fro. The sort of famous pictures where you see one person looks at the picture and sees an old crow and the other sees a young woman, and then when you've seen the trick, you can move to and fro, you can sort of, see the other thing. So I still hadn't blinked or moved my eyes at all. So I tried to see the face in that swirly pattern, and I couldn't. I couldn't bring it back. So what I decided was that I wasn't being given an explanation. I was witnessing censorship. My brain had decided it didn't want a ghost. And so my own assumption is that in the chaos of existence, everything is connected. And you only get a glimpse of that if you have a psychedelic experience, and then everything becomes meaningful and collected and like that and all that. But the brain's job is to save us from that noise. Extreme example is if you go to a game farm and you step out of your car and a tiger comes out of the undergrowth and walks towards you. You just go, tiger danger, car safety, whoomph, and you're in the car. But if you were tripping at the time, you might be so zonked out by the beauty of the tiger and the amazing sense of power and, and tiger burning bright and all that type of thing, you get eaten. So that's extreme. But at a less extreme, that man who doesn't bother about the coincidences that morning, but goes home and earns money for the rest of the afternoon, you could say, well, in a way, he's onto a winner. All this noise about meaningfulness and symbolism and everything like that, and artistic potential and everything. No, forget it. So that is what I feel the brain is doing. It's making a reality tunnel.
Yes.
Through what is actually a world of meaning and chaos and connections and everything. And significance.
Well, one of the reality tunnels that I guess I grew up with around thinking about magic and the occult and things like that, I grew up terrified of like the Ouija board and You know, when I first started practicing, experimenting with sort of magical rituals, I was convinced I was going to get possessed and things like that. And
Yeah.
and I would talk to people about, oh, I'm doing magical, and they would think I'd lost it. So
Yes.
why
Yes.
is it, do you
Yeah.
think, that not only the occult but magical thinking in general is kind of a label of denigration, isn't it? Why is it that it gets such a bad reputation in modern culture?
Well, in my thing of the four cultures, I suggest, the two opposite each other are magic and religion, justice, art, and science. And people who are neither magical or religious tend to equate the two. You know, oh, mumbo jumbo religion, it's really just magical thinking and everything. And
Yeah.
Crowley said, no, they're opposites. And actually, I take that point of view. Now, of course, in multidimensional space, you could be opposite in certain ways, but not in other ways. But the thing is that both magic and religion, for me, have the idea of a spirit world, a world which is invisible beyond our senses, and out of space and time, if you like. And but religious practice is really about lifting people up to the spirit, whereas magical practice for me is very often about bringing spirit down to the earth. And if I give the example of, if someone carves a piece of marble into a statue of Mary, Mother of Jesus,
Yeah.
they have brought sort of the spirit of Mary and the spirit down into this piece of stone. And people could use that rather like a telephone kiosk. You can kneel in front of it. But what they should be doing is sort of using this statue to take them up to the spiritual world, in communication with Mary, Mother of Jesus, and all that. Now, but what he did was he actually was making a magical talisman in the shape of Mary. Now, the reason that the Puritans so hated that is because they realized that if people are kneeling in front of this statue and asking to be healed, are they really going up and talking to Mary, or are they asking the statue to heal them? And that is, what's the word for that? Idolatry. That is a thing which is, deeply, deeply wrong and magical. And so there's a very great tension between magic and religion tends to condemn magic. Any good results you get, you'll say, no, that's God does it, not magic. Magic is wrong. And the academia really came out of religion. All the old universities were religious organizations, religious foundations. And there's a lot of sort of religious, not so much thinking as religious assumptions in academia. The need for strict definition, the need for boundaries, and if you say to someone, "Are you Catholic or pure or Protestant?" they'd be very surprised if you said both. You have all these divisions in
Yeah.
in religion, and academia is very much into that. People group around a certain discipline and separate themselves from other people, and they can be quite wary of interdisciplinary studies. So I think academia rails against magic, and that science is followed in those footsteps, and so it is a dirty word.
And so, but how did you? Because you trained as a mathematician, right? And so,
Yes.
how was it that you became interested then in the dirty word of magic?
Oh, yeah. Well, I already was, but I do remember a lesson when, because we were doing pure maths. Well, it was still, I was at school, so it was mixed at that stage. But when the teacher came in and wrote on the blackboard before we came in, let I be such that I squared equals -1, he had a revolution on his hands, because we said there is no square root of -1. No number's got a square root. It was all because we've been doing work. We're actually doing reductio absurdum proofs where you make some assumption and you end up with something x squared equals -1. And you say, well, obviously my assumptions were wrong because you can't have a square root of a minus number. So we were very angry about this, and it took a long time to calm us down. And then he said, well, look, forget whether it exists or not. Let's just see if it works. So we did algebra, where we put in the I, and whenever we squared it, we put a -1, and it worked. Oh, right, okay, so what, but, of course, complex numbers, which have I in them, are the very foundation of modern physics. It crops up in electricity theory and quantum theory and everything. So what you've got, the situation there, is something which we're told doesn't exist and is a waste of time, but it works. But what more, it not only works, it actually is very fundamental to our discovery of the way the universe works. Now, I couldn't help compare that with the people at Findhorn who bought a piece of land which was considered worthless, so close to the sea, and you couldn't really grow things on it. And they just said they were going to talk to the devas, or fairies, if you like, and ask how to grow things there. And they were very successful. They produced vegetables, and all the local people were amazed. How could you do that? So the thing was that, again, they were taking something which is supposed not to exist and be meaningless and nonsense, and they just found that it worked. And then, so the question is, if it worked, has it revealed something true about the universe, that these things exist? But that's taking it a step further. But I myself have done that. If you decide to ask your garden where to plant things, you might take the flower pot, the plant you've bought. Now the thing is, how do you ask the garden where to plant it? If you're very fortunate, much more than me, more psychic, you might hear a voice saying, go over there. But no, what happens is you just wander around with this plant around the garden and sort of be aware, very much, it's like mindfulness, very much aware of your inner state, and you find suddenly at one point you feel a rather good feeling, and so you move away from there. No, come back, and so you plant it there. And that sort of gardening works rather well. I didn't try to compare it, how it would compare with having a degree in horticulture, and learning all the techniques, but it is something that works. And so I would say that the square root of -1 is like a fairy.
Yeah.
It works. And that is quite fundamental to magic. Yeah, it's quite fundamental to magic, because it's like the first test is, does it work? And you can think of silly examples. I remember the sort of teenage stage where you've learnt all about rationalism and everything, and you think you know all the answers, and you think that winning a girl is a question of studying their psychology and reading up about men are from Mars and that sort of thing, and it doesn't work. But one day you see an advertisement for a really cool T-shirt, which looks just like all the others. It's black, but it's got a different logo on it, and you buy that, and you're actually buying a talisman. It becomes a power object. You wear it and you feel cool, and then you become cool. And but very few people would admit, actually, I've done some magic. I just bought a talisman and it worked. But really, that's what you're doing.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the Bardo podcast and you'd like to keep it going, the best way to do that is by joining us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Bardo podcast. The podcast is completely independent, there's no production company behind it. It's just me researching guests, recording conversations, editing episodes, making clips, writing newsletters, and generally trying to keep the whole thing afloat. If you'd like to support that, you can join from around £5 a month or whatever feels right for you. I'm also hoping to do more listener questions, bonus conversations, and Patreon exclusives as the community grows. And if money's a bit tight at the moment, no worries at all. Subscribing on YouTube, leaving a review, a comment, or simply sharing an episode with a friend really helps, more than you might think. Right, let's get back to the conversation.
And you, in fact, in my years of magical thinking, you have a nice example of that where you talk about it's basically a bunch of nerds, I think, who can't get they can't pick up women, and so they go and they join a pagan group and they begin to work with the divine feminine, and they do rituals, and
yes,
they come to understand that part in themselves. And then the other approach, as you said, is someone dresses cool to pick up women, gets the right branding, which is a talisman. So both are using magic, but one of them's using it consciously, and the other one's not.
That's that's it. It's sort of the humbug of pretending it's not magic. I mean, the whole thing of I worked with advertising people for a long time, and really that's a lot of what it's based on. Associations that people make and desires which link up with that alphabet of desire. So I think there's a lot of, basically I'd say there's a lot of hypocrisy, despising magical thinking and not actually recognizing how fundamental it is.
Yeah.
And to me it's actually I give an example where I think it follows on from scientific thinking. Very often people try to do something scientifically, learning psychology and all those sort of things like that. And then they realize that there's a limit to what they can do. And then they start adopting a magical technique, like buying a cool T-shirt, but not admitting what they're doing. And I gave the example of the baby, didn't I? The little baby. The brain, first thing the brain teaches the baby is about the material world, which is really the most dumbed down version of the world. Picks up a spoon and bangs it on the table, repeatable experiments. He's learning that it's solid, and then the next day when he comes back, looks at it's the same spoon, still there, bang, bang on the table. It's a solid object. And so he's learning proto-science. The world is made of solid objects, and they do predictable things like you drop it, it falls to the floor. But then you get the complexity of mother, who, yes, she will come and pick it up each time, but she does it differently, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And the big jump is, and you see it in the baby looking into eyes and sort of thing. Of course, he hasn't got language yet, but basically the baby is thinking, what if there's another me inside mother, another mind there? And that's the beginning of magical thinking, where mind could actually exist outside your own head. If the dog has got a mind, I can begin to understand some of the things it does. Wags its tail. If the weather's got a mind, I can begin to understand. It can look gloomy and fierce one day, and then it'll rain. And then it goes right up to the market trader who's got all this floods of information coming in. And he'll say, but I'm being very careful today because the markets are acting really nervous. So this recognition that there's a mind can appear outside your own head to me, that's fundamental to magical thinking. And yes, that's actually, I think, part of the reason why magical thinking is becoming a bit more accessible now, because with the idea of artificial intelligence, people are recognizing how a very complex system can begin to behave as if it has a mind as well. And so, in that case, something as complex as the rainforest, you can think of it as if it actually is a sentient creature that is responding to changes in the weather, changes in human behavior and things like that. And that way of thinking has got value.
It's a heuristic, isn't it? It's I think you say that it's a way of dealing with complexity.
Yes, that is what the baby is doing, realizing that something more complex about the mother's behavior, and then says, what if there's a mind inside her like mine? And I say, when you see the baby looking into the eyes and just learning to talk, it's that stage, and that learning, there's a traditional association between magic and language, and that's, I think, because they both sort of evolve at the same point. And the other thing that I'm aware of is that the scientific approach, that solid world objects, gives you explanations. The spoon falls to the floor because everything falls to the floor when you let it go of it. Whereas the idea that there might be a mind inside mother doesn't give you an explanation of everything she says, but it gives you more an understanding. So one day she doesn't clear up this mess of the spoon until later. And you get a sort of understanding, yes, she was agitated. When she's very busy, it could be she was very busy and that's why he did it. Now that is how magical results are often like that. They're best judged after the event, whereas scientific results should be examined by the prediction you make before the event. And I've given the example of say a coven of witches, and one of them gets terminal cancer and has only got 6 months to live. So they do a ritual to heal, a healing ritual. And of course, part of them, because of the world we live in, hopes there's going to be a miraculous cure. They go the next day and the person says it's all gone. But what might happen is they go the next day and the guy seems sort of not so, the atmosphere is lighter in some way. And they say, has it been healed? No, he says, I've still only got 6 months to live. But I've decided if I've only got 6 months to live, I'm going to live. There's books I haven't read, people I haven't been to, places I haven't visited. I'm going to do all these things. Now I know I've only got 6 months. Life is precious. And that, as magicians, they would say the healing ritual has worked. Of course, from a scientific point of view, it's a load of rubbish. He's still going to die in 6 months' time. You judge magical things more when you look back at them. Just as the baby will look back at mother's behavior and realize, I think I can understand it if she's got a mind, or I can understand what the dog's doing when it wags its tail. Whereas the scientific thing, you should predict forwards what's going to happen, and it should exactly match. And so when you look at a magical experiment in those terms, it's rubbish, didn't cure the cancer at all. But I point out the weird thing is that when someone is in that frame of mind, wow, I'm going to live now, I'm going to do everything I want, all that, very often that person will live longer than the 6 months. It'll extend their life. And then people say, that's the magic working. Whereas I would say, actually, the magic working was really that change of consciousness. The fact that it has results which you can explain scientifically, hormone changes in the body and all that sort of thing. That's why he lived longer. So you can explain that, but actually that change of consciousness really is the key that was turned in the lock and created the new future.
Yeah. And so that maybe continue that change of consciousness then, it reminds me of, so Aleister Crowley sort of would define magic as the art and science of change in conformity with will, I think. And Dion Fortune updated it to be the art of
consciousness.
Change of consciousness.
Yes, causing changes of consciousness. Yeah.
With will. So, but thinking about Crowley, who you also mentioned earlier, Aleister Crowley, and I know you're also a big fan of Osman's Spare. I wonder how, because Crowley has a reputation that is quite varied from genius to villain. What is it that you find valuable in sort of the work of Aleister Crowley and Fiend? Yeah, and so in the work of Crowley and the work of Osman's Spare, what is it about these individuals that you found valuable?
Well, Crowley, it was the first book I had of his was Magic in Theory and Practice, and one of the things he says is that you perform certain actions and you get certain results. Now, what you can't do from that is draw some conclusions about the nature of reality. And the thing is that from a scientific back culture, that's what you're trying to do is perform your experiments, and it gives you a clearer and clearer idea of the nature of the material world. You now find there are gases that mix and cause water and things like that. Crowley says that's not so in magic. And I found that interesting because it is like the baby making that discovery. It's about giving understanding of the world rather than verifying exactly what it is. And I think that it's a slippery thing, because say someone becomes interested in astrology and they don't think much of it, pretty stupid, and then they study it for a bit and they begin to get it. And I think it's necessary because you actually have to think yourself into it with some simple examples. Now, in terms of reality tunnels, what you're doing is listening to the noise. If you, say, study the phases of the moon and you're gardening, now, like the fourth person in my thinking who went back to work and ignored everything, one way of gardening is just to read up the manuals, put the right chemicals and plant it like that. But if you're working in a more magical way with the garden, you can begin to notice the rhythms of the moon and nature, and you become sensitive to the difference between the waxing moon and the waning moon, for example, or the new moon and the full moon. And you're becoming more aware of something. Now, the skeptic would say you're deluding yourself, beginning to suffer from apophagia, seeing connections with there. But the way I see it is that you're turning down, the brain's is trying to remove the noise of monthly cycles in order to simplify our lives. You just buy a packet of fertilizer or whatever like that. But if you actually tune into that noise, it becomes rather interesting. It's another dimension to your gardening, becoming aware of the monthly cycles, and you actually turn up and you become more and more sensitive to that noise, and then you can begin to make decisions based on that. I will plant seeds while the moon is waxing, and I will plant lettuces when it's in a water sign and things like that. Now, someone else who's skeptical wouldn't hear that noise, and they would say, oh, I just shoved the seed in and just put a nice lot of fertilizer on it. And that works quite well, but it's very, very pleasing and inspiring to be working with the cycle of nature and discovering it and getting to know it better and better. And that is, to be magical thinking, that's a side of it that I particularly like. And actually, that was something Peter Carroll, who founded the chaos magic thing, he was a science teacher, whereas I was a math teacher. And he came from the science side, and so he put a very big emphasis on results magic. He really worked with it to see to what extent you could approach it scientifically, clarify what you want to achieve, and what are the probability you could achieve it, and what are the steps to taking to increase that probability. And he was working from that angle, and I really admire his work because he does that very thoroughly and put into practice and made results magic a very powerful movement. But I've tended to be closer to the arts side of it. If you think of magic as you go from science through magic to art, I'm very much aware of the way that magical thinking enriches your experience. So, for instance, gardening takes on another dimension if you start playing either with the fairies or with the phases of the moon and things like that, or both together. You are having a richer experience. And I remember when I was talking to groups of pagans about my magical thinking, one of the things I said is that as I've grown older, I find I'm doing less magic to try to make things happen and more magic to celebrate what does happen. In other words, I find actually I'm more likely now to be doing a spring ritual or a summer solstice ritual just to celebrate that cycle than I am to be trying to do a spell to stop it raining on the summer solstice. And when I said that, I noticed quite a lot of heads always nod in the audience, and very often it's the older heads. And I think that that is part of the sort of evolution of magical thinking, is you come in wanting the power to do something which science hasn't really helped you to do, like winning the girl for that bunch of nerds. And you find rather unscientific ways of doing it. But the trouble with being able to shape the world to your will is that it means that you end up in a world that you have made, which is like being imprisoned in yourself. And of course, for most people don't get that far, so they don't get the full impact of it. But if you think of a dictator who is someone who has the power to make the world just as he wants it, this is now our capital city, tear down that church and build a ministry of something or other, we'll go to war with these people, send the army there. Those people have a way of going crazy, like Hitler. And you realize that if you are in a world that the more you've created your world, the more it's your fault for what doesn't work. If you get bored with it or whatever. Whereas if a lot of the pleasure of life comes through the uncertainties and the interesting things that can happen. And very often magic throws up that sort of trickster behavior.
Yes.
You do a spell for a certain purpose, and you get a trick answer which you can see that it fits what you asked for, but in a way you hadn't actually intended it. And then, do you then say, oh, well, the magic hasn't worked? Or do you explore it and say, what happened? What is it? What could it teach me? Has it expanded my world? Have I learnt something? If you look at it that way, it can be very interesting, the way magic works out. And I would say in a rather more artistic way. Because it's interesting to me that some people call magic the craft, the witchcraft people. It's the craft. And it is like, if you think of going from science, purposeful, trying to make things happen, craftsmanship is actually trying to make something happen. You want to design a new type of bowl for holding things, and you want to design a new type of bowl that people will want to buy. You are really doing something magical. You have an intention, and you're doing a ritual, spinning the pot or whatever it is. And if you then can sell that bowl to lots of people, then the magic's worked. So there's a strong analogy for me between craftsmanship and magic. But as you progress with it, you begin to be, presuming that you're successful and you now have other people working for you, all that, and you're becoming the master craftsman, you begin to get interested in doing something for the sheer expression of it. I now make surreal pots no one wants to buy, but I really love doing it. And really you're going towards being an artist then. You'll do something which is not designed so much for the purpose, for an objective. And I gave the example of a film. Someone wanting to film a book, if they say, oh no, we must have some Nazis in this film, we must have a car chase, because that gets bums on seats. I would say, actually, they're still doing magic rather than art. They're making a talisman to get bums on seats. And they know that if you have a Nazi in it and you have a car chase, you're putting the right things on the talisman to get bums on seats. But as you begin to get away from those deliberate implants towards just really expressing what you want, then you're moving away from magic into art proper, I'd say, or whatever you would call it. You're getting beyond that. So I see it as a sort of spectrum that goes from scientific determinism through craftsmanship to expression, and then towards. And the difference is, for me, is if you do make something or paint something or make a song or do a little ritual, then it's magic if it works for you and does what you want to intend to. But then when you hear someone behind you who's been watching saying, wow, that's brilliant, you realize you're moving into art, because what you did for yourself is actually amazing other people. And art brings in the group appreciation. If other people start saying, that is amazing, what you might just have done for yourself, of your own volition and your own desire, other people are recognizing the value in it. And that to me is very much a point of that you're going beyond magic towards art proper, getting into that art culture.
Well, I wonder if we could unpack what you're saying there a bit, because I have a thing where I'll say hello to magpies all the time, me and my mum. We always salute a magpie. Even if I'm with other people, I'll do it under my breath, do a little subtle, like, try and get away with it. And I'd say, but like saying hello to a magpie, reading the tarot, talking to trees, but also the scientific worldview, art, it can all involve magical thinking. And something that surprised me is that you mentioned it earlier, that it's not pre-scientific thinking, but post-scientific thinking. And magic is also pattern recognition, you say. And so you're talking about how it moves over into art. And I wonder if we could unpack a little bit your idea of the four cultures. You mentioned it earlier. And could you briefly explain just what they are exactly?
Well, I think that, as I say, talk in terms of discovering them, certainly not defining them, because they are different ways of looking. Now, people, when I first published something, people say, oh, I don't agree with this idea of dividing the world into four boxes: magic, religion, science, and art. And I point out, no, this isn't four boxes. It's four directions. Now, if I compare that with north, south, east, west, spatial thinking recognizes that is a compass bearing.
Yeah.
But there's a part of the mind which I think is probably, people ascribe it to the left brain, which doesn't like continua or spectrum. It always wants to make a division. So rather than face the fact that everyone in the world has got a bit of a right wing and a bit of a left wing in them, and some people have more and some people have less, they will divide the world into right wing and left wing. And so they were thinking, when they saw my diagram, their first thought was that I was trying to divide it into four different things. But I point out spatial thinking is actually a fractal division. And I gave the example, Cape Town is a southern city, whereas Oslo is a northern city. Yeah, I don't think people disagree with that. But if you come to Cape Town, there's just as much north in Cape Town as there is south in Norway. You know, we've got northern suburbs like that. And you realize that this is a fractal division. One little grain of sand on the beach in Cape Town will have a north side and a south side. And so if you take example of someone who's a scientist, and he is trying to goes to the laboratory to run tests to see whether a certain theory which he's wanting to test, if he could find proof that it doesn't work. That's pure science, because he's testing a hypothesis to see whether he can find counterexamples that break it. Now you might say to that person, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And he could give that answer: I'm just trying to test this hypothesis if it works. But he might say, this whole field I'm working in is actually a mess. There's a lot of conflicting ideas. There's the Russian version, the Japanese version. People are arguing about this whole thing about what quantum means and things like that. So I'm just trying to clear some of that mess, tidy this up, try to get down to some clear thinking on this. And I would say he's actually looking in the artistic direction, because he's trying to sort of polish this discipline and clean it up and make it more beautiful, and rather than the mess that it is. Now, someone else might say, the reason I'm doing this work is I think this experiment could help the problem of starvation in the world. I think I'm developing a type of wheat which will grow anywhere. And so I'm trying to solve the world hunger, famine crisis. Now I say he's thinking magically. And to fit to what I said before, how would you judge whether his experiment has actually helped cure hunger? Only by looking back at it. And he might say, now there are countries right across Africa can grow their own wheat, even if it's windy, because the wheat I developed will grow anywhere, even if there's not much water. Now, so that, he would say, as a magical practice, that worked. I mean, he wouldn't use the word magic, whatever. A magical person would say, your magic worked, yes. But the trouble is, you see, another person might say, that was an absolute disaster. Now, African countries that had a really rich indigenous agriculture of their own, growing things that were appropriate, now commercial big companies are getting them to grow nothing but wheat. And it's ruining the economy, because as soon as the price of wheat falls, that country is in disaster. And so actually that person's work caused a lot of harm. And so that is the thing, it emphasized this thing that magical thinking, the results of magic, you look back on them and decide to what extent they worked or they didn't. Now the other reason the person might say, I'm doing this experiment, is he might say, this scientific field has been overtaken by the loonies. There's a whole lot of stupid theories people are coming up, mumbo jumbo and like that. And I'm just doing this to bring us down to earth and just show what works. And that person is actually thinking religiously, because he's thinking he's on a crusade against people with crazy ideas. And he's a crusader, and Richard Dawkins was like that. He was crusading against the enemies of truth, he called them. But most people would say he's a scientist while he was doing that. But you see, so you could be in any position, and yet you could be looking in different directions. And the artist who decides he's going to do some careful work, some geometry work, to develop the theory of perspective, get perspective right, is actually thinking scientifically as he's doing that. Just as if he's very carefully mixing different materials to get exactly the colour he wants to get, you could say he's no different from the scientist in the laboratory mixing chemicals. But he's definitely doing art. But so that's why I try to see, if you think in terms of spatially, in terms of directions, it isn't a question of putting things in boxes. It's actually an awareness that of a fractal, all these fractal divisions. You can be a scientist working on a magical project, and yet you could do it rather artistically, or you might have religious intentions of improving the world. You've got all these layers that can come from that.
So we're sort of cycling through these directions all the time, is what you're saying, and
yes,
is that correct?
I think so. I try not to make too big a thing of that, because people then will want predictions. But I am aware that there was a magical revival. When I was brought up, there was a very strict logical positivism, and that got artificial intelligence off to a bad start, because the word artificial intelligence, now people are embarrassed by it, apart from just being a label, because the logical positive said, yes, the brain must be a mechanical process, mechanistic process. So all we have to do is to study the brain very closely and what neurons do and everything like that, and then replicate that in some sort of mechanical system, and it will be conscious, because consciousness is just a result of mechanical things happening in the brain. Now, actually, that didn't work. In the 60s, they realized that actually they couldn't just locate what was happening in the brain as a mechanical process and then imitate it. And so, but by then they were stuck with this word artificial intelligence. So that was a time of very extreme scientific skepticism. But it was followed by a hippie revival and a revival of magic. There was a magical revival of the late 60s into the 70s. And I was aware that the same thing had happened in the previous century. There was a time in Victorian times when science was, people would go to a theatre to see science demonstrations. It was just so cool, and it was hot news. And yet by the end of the century, there was the Golden Dawn, there was the Gothic revival, there was all these sort of return to magical thinking. And at the beginning of the 20th century, then you had the Roaring Twenties and a sort of new art forms, cinema, radio, art forms which came in as technical gimmicks, but by the end of the, say, 1930, they were great art forms. People were producing masterpieces. And so when I, in the 70s, I said we're coming out of that magical revival. We're coming into what you call the art culture. Now, how that manifested was money making, drugs, like the 20s, new dance forms, things like that. You had disco and things like that. So it was like a sort of, and the whole thing of being a yuppie was very, very like the behaviour of the 1920s and 30s. And then you had after the 30s, there came what I saw was a religious revival, but the religions happened to be communism and fascism. And that sort of cycle repeated because you had, that ended with a crash. And similarly, there was the 1980s financial crash, and then you had the decade of evangelism. There was a sort of religious revival in the 90s. And then you had Richard Dawkins and the skeptical movement. You had back to Scepticism. And then you had the sort of magical revival with the internet. So I do see this as a sort of a cycle going round. But I just I try not to be too much predicting and sort of say, at a certain year this is going to happen. I just notice a sort of pattern, which I recognise, a cyclic pattern. I suppose, like the phases of the moon in the garden.
Yeah. So with this idea of pattern recognition, then, so I think you were talking earlier as well about speaking to the garden, and you've written elsewhere about the idea of demons as like a personification of complex information. Are people doing that now, I guess, with like the algorithm or capitalism, like the market? They're maybe personifying these systems in a magical way.
Yes. Well, I think it's recognizing the fact that they have they're sentient, recognize them as sentient beings. The thing is that back in the very skeptical 50s, what made man different from creatures? It was man the tool maker. It was our science, our tool making. That was what distinguished us. That's why our brains are so big and so on and so forth. But they found out later that actually the evolution of the brain was much more to do with our very complex social factors. That's when the brain exploded, with the use of language and communication. And so I say that when the baby looks at mother and begins to think of her as might have a mind like he has, is actually using much more of his brain. And I say that a lot of, give the example of, a problem child. Now, if you were given a problem child and what you're going to do about it, you could try to tackle that scientifically. Fix him up with in a brain scan and all that. Fire a lot of randomly chosen words at him to see where he reacts. And after several days of doing that, you might find that he seems to react very powerfully to the word father, and the sort of, and cruelty or something like that. And you come to the conclusion, this problem child must have been treated badly by his father. But I would say, if you just sat down with him and talked with him for an hour or two, you would very quickly come to that conclusion much quicker, because you're not teaching him treating him like a mechanism that you can take apart and put together. You're using your whole social brain to, as it were, tune into him and see how he responds. And I think that when people talk to the office copier and things like that, when it seems to be misbehaving, it may not produce very good results, but they're doing something which is very natural, very human, and something that our brain is very good at doing. And so, if you consider that your life is beset by a demon, a whole pattern of bad luck, and things going wrong, and every time you pull yourself out of that situation, you find you're back in it and all that. The idea of treating that complex of happenings as a demon, a sentient being, and speaking to it, just as I went around the garden with the plants, speaking to the garden and saying, where do you want to be planted? Is not stupid. And I would say, actually, there's potential for that being a pretty wise thing to do. There's one thing, can I bring this up?
Yeah.
The last one of yours that I saw, the guy talking about reality times, you used an expression at the beginning, which I thought was very interesting, about the choice of belief systems. There was a word you had for that. What was it?
Model agnosticism?
That's it. Just say it again. Model, yes. Yeah. In the beginning of, or near the beginning of my years of magical thinking, I give this idea of the layers, the truth layer. And this comes from the Platonic idea that we are living in a cave and we're looking at shadows moving on the wall, and this is the world we think is the real world. Whereas if we turn around and look towards the entrance of the cave, we'll see the light streaming in, and we'll see the things, the real things, which are causing those shadows. And that is like enlightenment. We now know the truth. And so this idea, you've got the world we're living in, all the things that are happening, and then there's a truth layer, which is when we know what is really happening. And the thing that struck me as a child was that what different people had different things on their truth layer. You talked about doing a Ouija board thing, and it's sort of a bit frightening and exciting, and you begin to get some results. Now, one lot of people came to us and said, don't do that. That's the devil. It's all false information the devil's giving you. We said, but we began to get quite good. That's even worse. That's the devil, the cleverness of the devil. He's luring you in, you see. But another lot of people came and said, don't do that. That's stupid. The human brain has a tendency to try to make meaning out of things, and that's what's happening. It's fooling you into thinking you're getting into it. And we said, but we began to get quite good results. That's dangerous. You've got to be careful there, because now you're going down the path of insanity, you see. So both people were telling us we were wrong, and what the real truth was, but they had different truths. And so I had this idea that actually Plato does something very wonderful. There's this ordinary world we live in. He adds a truth layer, and there is what is really happening. And that's wisdom, to discover the truth layer. The only trouble is there are so many different things on that truth layer. There's the fact that this God, the world this world was made by God, in 7 days. The other is that this world was made by random chances of chemicals mixing and things like that. And another is that we humans have got guardian angels which are telling us what to do. There are all these different truths. And so I suggested above that a games layer, which is a layer where you say, I get to choose which truth I'm going to live with today. And that really is very much the chaos magic thing. Pete Carroll's thing of practice living different truths. One day I'm going to be a fundamentalist Christian, and I'll interpret everything that happens in terms of fundamentalist Christianity. Another time I'll be a skeptical scientist. Everything that happens I'll interpret that way. And the thing is to just really live, if you play these different truth games with all your heart and see how well they work. So it's back to the magical thing of, whether something works is really the test, rather than I've now found the truth because it worked, which is what Crowley was warning us against. So that seemed to relate to this idea of the model agnosticism.
Definitely.
Is that right? Yeah.
Definitely.
That's it.
That's
yes,
right.
that's it. So, and very fundamental to chaos magic, this sort of...
I know.
Hello there, just a quick reminder that I run a small online meditation group on the 2nd and 4th Sundays of every month. No experience is needed and everyone is welcome. I certainly don't know what enlightenment is, I'm still learning myself, but it's simply a chance for a group of us to sit together, practice, spend some time in good company. Lovely way to start a Sunday. You can join as a paid Patreon member, or if money's a little tight right now, you can also join as a free member on patreon.com/the Bardo Podcast. You'll find all details about that in the show notes. Right, let's get back to the conversation.
Well, I love this idea of the games layer, and I guess in my own life, I'll often tell myself I'm just playing a game. But for example, I have to use social media to promote the podcast and my comedy. And I'll be like, it's just a game, but then I'll find myself refreshing it and taking it a little bit too seriously. So how do we, you write in your book as well about the yuppies ended up becoming, the game started playing them. They almost became possessed by the game.
Yes.
So how do we, two questions really. One is how do we remember that the game's layer and not get too seduced by it? And secondly, if magical thinking is, how do we distinguish healthy magical thinking from conspiracy thinking as well,
Well, I have one angle on conspiracy thinking, which doesn't quite fit your broader question, but I would point it out. Once you start recognizing that complex systems, and they don't have to be electronic, it could be water churning down a thing, or it could be a rainforest or something. Once you recognize that complex systems can behave in a sentient manner, then you begin to see how they can work to serve themselves. Now, something like the pharmaceutical industry very clearly has to do things to help people, because it depends on that for getting money. But is it actually serving us as human beings or humanity? How much is it actually serving itself? And just finding a useful way of serving itself is to provide cures, which keeps us hooked on it. And I realize that if you think in terms of the ecosystem of capitalism, where profit and growth are the measures of excellence. I gave the example of two companies, one of which provides a cure for what I've got, arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, which means that, say, for 6 months I take their tablets and then no more rheumatoid arthritis. My fingers straighten out, I could go jogging and everything. That company. And another company produces something which helps reduce the pain in the thing, gives me a little more mobility and all that. But it does have side effects, skin blotches, dizziness, swollen feet and things like that. Which of those two companies is going to win the capitalist race? And the answer is the second one, because the first one, every person cured is a customer lost. The other thing is that person, people will keep having the remedy because it's helping, but the company also sells skin cream for rashes. It also sells sleeping tablets for your dizziness. It also sells things to reduce the swelling of your legs. And that company will make much more money. Now, the thing is that it's so easy when you see the extraordinary figures for iatrogenic medicine, iatrogenic melodies, the illnesses that are caused by people taking commercial medicines, that it's very understandable to think, who are the bastards who are planning this? Who are the bastards who are saying we must make sure there are side effects so we'll make more money? And I say, I'm not saying proving there aren't people like that. There might be, but actually, from all I know of the pharmaceutical industry, people think they're doing good. They really believe that they're helping mankind, with these remedies, things like that. But you see, if you understand the entity, you'll realize that it is growing like a cancer growth. The entity knows that the way to keep growing in our capitalist system is to provide not cures, but a medical help which has got snags built into it. Because the company that does that will sell all its other products as well, make more money, then that company's got more money for advertising, it's got more money for research and development, and that company will just grow and grow like a cancer cell. And the business world will be excited by it and will buy shares in it. Now, there's an awful lot of things which look like conspiracies, but actually, if you look at them, you can see that it's really there's the entity there which is caught up in this thing of growth is what it's valued for. And I always have this feeling that when you hear a politician say proudly, we're increasing police spending by 10% this year. He's very proud of that. But what I would like to hear is that our anti-crime methods are so effective, we're reducing police spending 10% this year. We're closing down some hospitals because there aren't enough people in to fill the beds. That I would like the value of an entity, a business, a product section, to be valued in terms of what it has achieved rather than its growth. And yet we're so set on this idea that the measure of success is growth, that actually we're really awarding the cancer cells in our body for growing. And I think that's very fundamental, that. And so I think conspiracy theories are great fun, and in the spirit of Illuminatus, terrific, But myself, I often think, actually, there's something in the system. You don't need these wicked people. It's a simple answer, that there's something in the system which innately is acting against the good of society, and so that's. So sorry, that's a bit of a diversion, because you were really asking how conspiracy theories fit into the general magical thinking, and I think they fit pretty well, actually. Yes. Yes.
So, well, I guess with conspiracy theories, they are quite concerned with power. They're often from a position of feeling disempowered. And what's your sort of, because you write quite a lot about power, actually, I think. What's your sort of understanding of power?
Yes, well, one of the things that I became aware of is the extent which people think of power and strength as the same thing. And I find very irritated when people talk about Putin, Netanyahu as strong men, because, and Hitler, the prime example, strong man. Actually, what struck me about Hitler is he was incredibly weak. He was very powerful, so powerful that you wouldn't dare say anything against him because he could just have you snuffed out like that, hung with piano wire and whatever. But because of that, no one dared speak the truth to him. I remember hearing about one very accomplished, I think it was an Air Force person, the Luftwaffe man, who could see the disaster that was coming because Hitler was insisting on developing bombers, when actually what we needed to defeat the British would be fighter jets, fighter planes. So he had it all worked out, the facts and figures, and he went to Hitler to tell him there's a big mistake. We can put it right. The glorious Luftwaffe can win. And Hitler ranted and raved and screamed at him that he wasn't being patriotic and he was insulting the Luftwaffe and things like that. And so he came out a sort of trembling wreck. And it's that sort of thing which meant that Hitler could live more and more in his deluded world, where he had absolute power, but he was so weak he couldn't bear hearing one bit of truth that didn't please him. And that's weakness. And I think that I see the same thing in Saddam Hussein. It was a very interesting series about his life on television. And one of the things I noted was that he began with really a very sort of democratic, open ideas, but he became the sort of tyrant that people wouldn't dare tell him anything that he didn't like the sound of. And that's why he went to war. By that stage, he thought he had a super army, fantastic weapons, he was the ruler of the world sort of thing. And actually, the war, he was defeated very quickly because the word, and I think that's what Putin did with Ukraine. He was convinced he only had to storm in there and would be welcomed by the Ukrainians. But actually, he was weak because he couldn't face the truth. And it took me a long time to learn that. It will take a long time. Yeah, so that's my feeling that power and strength, there's something inverse about them. And I gave the example of, the young pharaoh with his servant, with his slave. And they, as little kids, they play together and, have a great time. And then one day the young pharaoh is a bit tired after a day's play, so he orders his servant to carry him back. And of course the servant knows that his family would be slaughtered if he didn't obey the command of the young pharaoh. And so he carries him back. And the pharaoh, with time, begins to get more and more used to this. And so he orders him to carry him back more and more and more. And what is developing is that the slave is becoming stronger every time he has to walk carrying this servant. He gets stronger and stronger. Yeah. And the pharaoh is getting weaker and weaker until the point he has to ask him to carry him back because he can't walk that far, And I think this is a sort of general rule. And I give the example of, rugby players, these huge, strong men. And then they get a coach, and the coach is half their size, but they give the coach their power. And the coach will scream at them, "Another 10 press-ups, you lazy bastards, come on," all that sort of stuff, They're giving him the power, and they are the ones who are getting stronger. So I think there's a real thing there, which I don't think people really are recognizing that properly. And of course, that magical approach that I like, where you put more attention into experiencing what happens and seeing the richness of that experience and sort of, as it were, artistically building on it, you're actually coming stronger as you do that. rather than when you're doing results magic and you're finding out what works and applying it, you're gaining power. And so, in some way, which is still beyond my understanding, what you really want to do is, if you can understand the relationship between power and strength, is how actually to build both so that you get the best of both worlds. But I think it does need the understanding of that distinction.
Well, to bring it back to experiencing things then, and this games layer of reality that you speak about, as a performer, I'm very interested in this idea of games layer and play. And I went to this tea ceremony, and many, many years ago, and I wasn't interested in magic or Buddhism or anything like that then. And everyone was naked, and I was like, this is not for me immediately. And then I drank this tea, and I started playing a bongo, and we started singing to the earth and evoking our ancestors. And suddenly I was like, this is exactly what we should all be doing all the time. And I think people maybe are hungry for ritual, but they don't know how to express that in some way. In what way do you think like games and ritual are part of modern life now?
Well, this is difficult for me because I'm now in my 80s and living in South Africa, and very much missing, when I was in England, all the magic friends I had, and how much I loved, going to someone's cottage and lighting the candles and going to Stonehenge and sleeping there and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
I really miss that. And I think that there's a discontinuity which a lot of people blame on COVID-19, that they're sort of dropping in on a friend and sitting by the fire and sharing things and chatting and all that sort of stuff. It's very hard to believe that thing, it sort of broke that hunger for that. I think people are hungry for it, but how do you do it? And one of the things I noticed in South Africa, that houses are surrounded by barbed wire and high walls. And so I found myself thinking, oh yeah, I'd like to drop in on the neighbours. I want to find someone else who's interested in magic around here, drop in on the neighbours. But because there's barbed wire and the high fences, the only way you could do that is you have to phone them up or email them first, or now it's WhatsApp, which means you've got to find their phone number, and you've got to have WhatsApp working at that time. And if you say, I would love to pop in and have a cup of tea or something, or say hello, I'm your neighbour, because of that crust that has developed, the person will feel, well, I'm a bit busy today, but how about Saturday? And they will feel they'll have to set the table, get the cakes, do this, that, the other, and make it into a tea party. Whereas what I remember my happy days at university is that you would knock on the next door and say, hello, I've run out of sugar. If you've got some you could lend me, and you would end up having tea together. Or the person would say, I'm sorry, I'm busy, but you can put the kettle on if you like. It's so easy. And I would say that's natural. And I was talking to someone the other day when they were complaining about all these sort of, the things you have to do in order to get people socialising, that sort of thing, and all thing. And he said, all I want is the way it used to be. I want a life which is sort of relaxed and everyone is meeting together and all sort of thing. And I said, I think what you're asking for is what I would call a normal life. And I think what we're living now is somehow not normal. I'm really enjoying this conversing with you, but I would really like to be sitting in the same room, sharing a cup of tea with you while we were doing it.
Yeah,
it's
of course.
It doesn't satisfy me fully sensually, and it'd be nice if you were just 100 yards walk down the road.
Yeah.
Put on my coat, knock on your door. Are you busy? Oh, I'll come back. But it's somehow the formality of arranging a time and time zones and everything. It's all keeping us separate. And I know that Matt Cameron, he worked when Oculus first came out, and he worked on, and this was before COVID, yes. He was interested in whether virtual reality headset, people could do joint rituals together, and he started doing work on that. And it was an interesting idea. How much would you have to have in a virtual reality that you come away with a real satisfaction feeling that you've done something together? I don't think it's impossible, but work is needed on that. And I'm afraid that the way the industry goes, and again, it's this example of the IT industry as a mechanism for trapping humans and getting money out of them so it can expand. It wouldn't. It would rather put the emphasis on how to get the biggest number of people coming to that event and paying for it, rather than how each individual could be giving a sensory experience which is so full and so related to their needs. I think in Words Made Flesh, I saw, when we talk about, the artistic phase and new art forms, I suggested the new art forms for the 80s would be computer games. And I made a prediction which I don't think has happened yet. I said that by 2000, I think we'll have computer games where the joystick is actually measuring your skin resistance. So it would set up situations like a big dark shape swoops in from above, and it judges your state of alarm and learns from that in order to create a richer and richer experience. And I said, when things like that, and it might even be attached to your head, so it got sort of picking up brain signals and feeding that information in. When you get to that sort of computer game, I would say computer gaming would become a serious art form where you could go into a computer arcade and come out a changed person. You'd have learned things. It would be like having a session with a psychiatrist or something. Really sort of finding. And I don't think it's gone down that line enough. But I may be wrong. I don't know enough about it. I lost interest, really. But I see potential there for really subtle analysis of the feedback that you get from the person holding the joystick. And the other thing was how quickly they type a word in. Are they nervous? Do they mistype? If it begins to assess all these things and really to respond, to learn about you and give you experiences which are like initiatory experiences, frightening or scary experiences which really have meaning for you. And yeah. Gee,
Very
how did we get
interesting.
onto that?
It's very interesting, yeah.
Yeah. I'm revising the book Words Made Flesh because a Spanish publisher said he wanted to do a Spanish edition. And I thought, that's so out of date. It was written in 1986, it'll be awful. So I said, look, I'll have to go through revising it, before I give it to you. And then I started reading. I thought, actually, it's terribly out of date in certain aspects, but it's a sort of very interesting book. So I've been revising it. And so these things are quite sort of high in my mind. Yeah, sorry.
Well, No problem. I think what you were touching on that was interesting there was around meaning, and that there does seem to be. I definitely noticed that crustiness on my, especially living in London where everyone's busy. I'm often like, it needs to be scheduled to do stuff with others, and I know that elsewhere you've compared like ritual to like a party. Like you arrange the atmosphere in a certain way to get.
Oh yes, yes.
So to deal with this sort of alienation that we are maybe developing, or there's also like a sense of nihilism as well. Do you think that magic offers a different path? Because it's you said it's about creating meaning in a way.
Yeah. If I take the most mechanical analogy I'd like is say that our world is beginning to be fitted together like clockwork. You fix a time for me to speak to you, and I struggle to get my camera going, like that, and so sort of timing and everything getting measured. How long we're going to talk for and whether it's suitable length or all these measurement things. I would say that just in terms of that very mechanical analogy, which is very limited, I think, but it has some play. I would say magic is like putting oil on the wheels. It's a way, helps it to flow, and so that would be my starting point, I'd think. The tiresome business of I've got to be there for a certain time and this, that, and the other. A sense of, if one had gone all the way down the astrology thing, you might feel, wow, what a great time's chosen, because Mercury's just going into my first house at this moment. It's sort of, there are very many different aspects of magic which could act like oils on the wheels and sort of bring back the flow to life. If I try to dig deeper, digital processing, do you know my analogy of reality tunnels and the desktop on your computer?
No, maybe if you could explain that.
Oh, right. Yes. Reality tunnels, what you're tunneling through. And I came to the sort of philosophical assumption, you're tunneling through chaos, total chaos. And that is what reality is. Now, in chaos, think as a mathematician, everything must be connected to everything else. There's no two things which haven't got some connection. Why? Because if you had two things A and B which are not connected, you no longer have chaos, because you've got structure, because the world splits into all the things connected to A and all the things connected to B, and they're not connected together, those A and B. So it wouldn't be chaos. So to be total chaos, everything must be connected to everything else. And the whole function of the brain, I suggested, was to boil that down to simple solid objects which stick around and are there the next day and work. And I say, well, that's what the Mac or Windows desktop is doing. Because if you put it in terminal mode and you see what's actually happening, it's a sort of flurry of down and down and down of symbols and numbers and letters and things like that. It's absolute chaos of rubbish. And it's actually worse than that, because if you look at each of those characters, in fact, it's made up of zeros and ones. So it's really just a sort of tsunami of zeros and ones flowing down. And all those zeros and ones are as positive or negative states of silicon. It's yin and yang is at the bottom of all of this. But you see, you don't work with that chaos. That chaos is then organized into a desktop, which is a reality tunnel through that chaos. And it's reality because it behaves like the child finding out what's solid. There's my notes for a lecture, and it's a real object because I'll come back the next day and switch it on, it'll still be there. Or I can move it across the screen like that, I can move it back, I can move it into a file called my lecture notes, and next day it'll still be there. And you see there's no magic. It's not like a conjurer with cups and balls. I moved my essay into a file called my essay file, and it's turned into a lemon. What fun! That's magic. That's what a conjurer would do. No, it's absolutely there. It's still there. It's absolutely fixed. And so I'd be given, and like the fourth person in my story, the one who says that's all rubbish, I went home and I worked for the rest of the day. It's this desktop which gives you such a simplified tunnel through all that chaos of zeros and ones and numbers and everything, that you can work on it. You can write things and they'll be there the next day. You can keep them there. You can like that. Now, it's behaving like it's a reality, in the sense that no magic is allowed. You can't have things just vanishing and appearing. If it is, it's a bug and you've got to do something about it. But it enables you to work, and that's what our brain is doing for us, simplifying the world. Now, this question of meaning, the guy on the desktop will say, there's an article which is my article for something rather, and over there that's my timetable for my schedule for next week. There's no connection between them. No, nothing connection. It's totally different. And that's a poem I wrote, that one down there. No connection. But actually, a programmer would say, well, they're all Word documents. So they're very intimately connected. It's just the connection is covered up. Different. If you updated Word, it might change the fonts between them. They might all change at the same time, but that's magic. Not really allowed. Those are separate objects and there's no meaningful connection. And yet they're all just made of that slush of zeros and ones and zeros and ones and everything, but presented as solid, tangible objects. And so that, to me, that's a good analogy of not only the relationship between the solid world of facts and figures and time scales we're given, but how a way of seeing that there is actually something behind it all. And that's something behind it all. Why can't we just grasp it? Because actually the brain is doing a very good job of cutting out all that noise, giving us a world that we can live in and all that. But I think it's done it so well now with the triumph of Victorian science that we're beginning to feel claustrophobia in that world. We're beginning to relish the absurdities. I mean, conspiracy theories, they add a bit of extra colour to the boring news that comes every day, that Trump's saying the same thing he was saying last week and has been saying for the last month. Europe's reacting in the same way, Putin's reacted the same way. A lovely, rich conspiracy theory. That's like one of those. You talked about the guy who did Razorhead. Yes,
David Lynch. Yeah,
David Lynch. Yeah, that's it. The richness and interest that comes from that. So the thing is, can we start playing with conspiracy theories rather than believing in them? Because believing in is really a religious thing. Believing in religion binds people together. That's what the word means, religio, binding together. It binds people into groups. So if you believe in something in a religious way, you're on the in-group and you despise the people who are outside that group. So that say Richard Dawkins, despised magical thinkers and said they were enemies of reason. And so if you believe in a conspiracy theory in a religious way, you then become to hate the people who don't believe in it. Whereas I think possibly if you could believe in it in a playful way, you could be in a more of a dancing situation. And I think satire I think is a good. I wrote a book under 1 million pseudonyms called the Hellgate Chronicles. I don't know, had you come across that?
No, I haven't.
No, it was a satirical column I ran through from the 70s to the 90s for a small magazine. It was called The Satanist Diary, and it was a response to these sort of conspiracy theories that the world is actually run by wicked Satanists. So in this thing, yeah, dead right. The Honourable Hugo C. St. John Lestrange, he's this wicked, I had a distinction between, he's the wicked Satanist, whereas Dr. Sigismund Galgenspiel is the evil Satanist, and they're great friends, and they're running the world, and it's and it becomes funny because it isn't that easy to run the world, nasty little bits of good keep springing up here and there and spoiling the fun, So, so basically, it's a collection of a long-running satire, the Hellgate Chronicles. I got a feeling that actually there's a future for satire.
What you're touching on there is very empowering because you're talking about playing with ideas, and this returns us to the games layer, and using belief as a tool to become.
Yeah.
There's more freedom in that, isn't there? That you said it's a dance.
Yes, and I think if just that overall sort of the judgment of not its growth, but what works, you'll find that certain sets of beliefs actually make life a bit richer, that type of thing. And with Crowley's warning, that doesn't mean they're necessarily absolute truths. So don't go preaching them, but do enjoy them and do work with them. And,
Well, I think that's a really nice place to end. And I just want to thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a very enjoyable conversation. I'm wondering we can find out more information. Your YouTube videos are really great. I recommend those.
Ah, yes. Yeah, I haven't done one for a bit. I've been snowed under with tax returns and things like that, and an awful lot of people I know dying, which is very hard for me to come to terms with. But that's what happens when you're in your 80s. So life has been difficult, but I always enjoy doing those because they're so much quicker than writing. You can blather for half an hour.
They're great. They're really good.
I do have a website, but I haven't looked at it for years. I assume it's still there, but I don't think it's a Ramsay Dukes one. Yeah, that's it. So Ramsay Dukes website, and the books, of course. That's it. Yeah.
Of course. I'll put links to it all in the description.
Oh well, thank you very much. Yes,
thank you.
Well, right. I've enjoyed this hugely, actually.
It's been really enjoyable.
That's it for this week's episode. Big thanks to Lionel for such a lovely, thoughtful and delightful conversation. If you'd like to explore more of Lionel's work, I recommend My Years of Magical Thinking, along with Stop For Me, Sex Secrets of the Black Magicians Exposed, Words Made Flesh. It goes by Lionel Snell, and also Ramsay Dukes for some books. I'll put a link to those along with his website and YouTube channel in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you subscribed, commented, left a review, or shared it with someone who enjoys conversations about philosophy, psychology, spirituality, comedy, or just weird and unusual ways of looking at the world. It genuinely helps more people discover the podcast. And if you'd like to support the show and help keep it independent and ad-free, you can do that over on patreon.com/The Bardo Podcast. You also find details there about the online meditation group, as well as bonus content I'm hoping to put up as the community grows. You can find out everything else I'm up to over at marcsalmoncomedy.com, Marc with a C. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time in between. Have a good one.